Hello, welcome to this presentation. I am Lotte Hoeks and I will give you a short introduction to the European Union Conflict Minerals Regulation. In 2017, the European Union created a new regulation on conflict minerals, which will enter into force the 1st of January 2021. With an eye to both monitoring and adherence to responsible sourcing, it is at the level of the producing countries that the capacities and awareness of this EU regulation is vital. During this presentation, I will give an overview of the EU regulation and clarify how this regulation, with its requirements, can affect producing countries. I will thereby focus on artisanal and small-scale mining communities. Before I will present the EU regulation, it is helpful to have a common understanding of the supply chain. From the mine, transport, trading centers, mineral processors, and refiners or smelters is called the upstream part of the supply chain. From the metal trader to the product manufacturer and retailer is called the downstream part of the supply chain. The European Union regulation aims to help break the link between income generated by the mineral trade and the continuation of armed conflict. The legislation does this by imposing obligations with regard to mineral supply chain due diligence. The regulation only focuses on tin, tantalum, and tungsten, their ores, as well as on gold. In short, these minerals are often called 3TG minerals. The European Union has chosen to only focus on 3TG minerals because they are particularly important, as they are in high demand, because they are central to the production of electronic devices such as smartphones and computers. The European Union makes the recommendations of the OECD due diligence guidance mandatory. Importers into the European Union of 3TG minerals must carry out due diligence on their supply chain. They have to check where the minerals and metals they have imported have been mined, and they have to check whether they have been processed responsibly. The OECD due diligence guidance clarifies how companies can identify and better manage risk throughout the entire mineral supply chain, from miners, local exporters, and mineral processors to the manufacturing and brand name companies that use these minerals in their products. The OECD follows a 5-step framework, which is an ongoing process. The first step is to establish strong management systems. The second step is to identify and assess risks in the supply chain. Thirdly, companies must design and implement a strategy to respond to the identified risks. Fourthly, companies must carry out independent third-party audits of supply chain due diligence. Finally, companies must report annually on supply chain due diligence. Past experiences, notably the US Dodd-Frank Act, have proven that regulatory measures only targeting a limited number of countries have no major impact on the resolution of violent conflicts and do not enter financing. The European Union regulation has learned from this limitation of the Dodd-Frank Act and pursues a worldwide approach, including all conflict-affected and high-risk areas. In short, these are called CARAs. This global geographical scope of the European Union regulation reduces the likelihood of blacklisting one country or one region. Conflict-affected areas are characterized by the presence of armed conflict, widespread violence, or other risks of harm to people. High-risk areas are areas with, for example, political instability, insecurity, widespread violence, and/or widespread human rights abuses. The list with CARAs countries has not yet been published, but will reportedly be published soon on the website of the European Commission. All actors in a mineral supply chain can be at risk of contributing to adverse impacts of the mineral trade, regardless of their position in the supply chain. These risks include serious human rights abuses and providing direct or indirect support to non-state armed groups or to public or private security forces. It is important to note that the regulation does not contain provisions pertaining to environmental standards on and around mining sites. Can a company source from conflict-affected and high-risk areas? Yes, it certainly can. It is actually the objective of the OECD due diligence guidance to promote responsible private engagement in fragile states. Companies must make sure, however, that they manage risks and provide evidence that there are virtually no risks of financing conflicts or violating human rights. CSOs from producing countries can have an important role to assist companies with this. For example, by conducting research and publishing information at regional and mindset level on the presence or the absence of the risks, as well as on the political and the security context. Civil society organizations can also assist by documenting impacts, particularly on communities and the most vulnerable groups. The European Union regulation exempts companies using 3TG minerals in manufactured products. It is worth mentioning here that the raw materials, so the materials that are covered by the regulation, are rather trivial in the EU trade flows with non-European countries. The total import of raw materials represented less than 5% of the EU imports in 2018, whereas machinery, vehicles, and other manufactured goods that contained 3TG minerals represented 56% of EU imports. In short, this means that the vast majority of EU companies use 3TG minerals, but they are importing them beyond the metal stage, and therefore they fall outside the EU regulation. The EU own estimate is that the regulation applies directly to between 600 and 1,000 importers, and indirectly to about 500 smelters and refiners of 3TG minerals. Secondly, the EU has proposed exemptions for smaller importers, making the regulation voluntary for small and medium-sized enterprises, while it remains mandatory for the larger importers. The EU has set thresholds. These are set at a level that ensures that no less than 95% of the total volumes imported into the European Union of each mineral and metal is covered. However, the thresholds do not guarantee that only the lower risk imports will be exempted from the requirements of the regulation under the thresholds. Actually, on the contrary, there are good reasons to suspect that many of the highest risk imports into the EU are transacted in relatively low quantities, some of which may fall below the thresholds and therefore fall outside the scope of the EU regulation. The EU has not made a dataset disaggregated by individual importer. Since this list is not public, it is hence difficult or actually impossible for civil society organizations to anticipate whether direct EU imports from specific countries such as the Central African Republic, Sudan, Colombia will be affected by the regulation. The relatively low direct imports suggest that many may fall below the regulation thresholds and therefore fall outside the scope of the regulation. However, since this list is not made public, we cannot determine this with certainty. To give you an example on the thresholds, I will only give an example on gold here. Refined gold has a threshold of 100 kilos and unrefined gold has a threshold of 4 million kilos. This means that a company, an individual importer, importing less than 4 million kilograms of unrefined gold does not fall under the regulation, so thus is not obliged to conduct mineral supply chain due diligence. Again, it is important to stress here that trade data suggests that there are reasonable chances that direct imports from conflict-affected and high-risk areas are exempted from the regulation as a consequence of these thresholds. There is a potential risk that the regulation may encourage companies in Europe sourcing from artisanal and small-scale miners to withdraw from the small-scale sector, as the latter cannot comply with the due diligence standards set by the downstream companies. This risks favoring large-scale miners in producing countries, as they have better capacities to comply with the new requirements. The cost of traceability and certification schemes is often borne by artisanal and small-scale miners. It is important, therefore, that industry schemes need to ask their downstream members to divide and spread the costs, instead of charging them only on the artisanal and small-scale miners. Without support to the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, mining actors may increasingly depend on a reduced number of purchasers, for example from China, which can negatively impact their trading position in the market. Therefore, the European Union has committed to a series of accompanying measures, specifically intended to support responsible mineral sourcing in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. These accompanying measures aim at supporting artisanal miners, state and non-state actors in creating conditions on the ground for transparent and responsible supply chains. The efforts of the accompanying measures are focused on three main groups of stakeholders, namely the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, local communities, and local authorities. The priority areas for support will be the sustainable development of the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, leading progressively to its formalization. By the 1st of January 2023 and every 3 years thereafter, the European Union should review the functioning and effectiveness of the regulation. This review shall include an independent assessment of the proportion of the total downstream companies which have due diligence schemes in place. This also includes the impact of the regulation on the ground, so in producing countries, as well as the need for additional mandatory measures in order to ensure sufficient leverage on the responsible global supply chain of minerals. As mentioned in this presentation, there is a reasonable chance that direct imports from conflict-affected and high-risk areas are exempted from the requirements of the EU regulation as a consequence of the import thresholds. Moreover, since the aggregated trade data is not publicly available, we cannot say which countries will or which countries will not be affected by the EU regulation. Despite this major lack of transparency, we still believe that the European Union regulation is relevant for CSOs from producing countries. First of all, CSOs can play an important role to ensure that transparent production chains at the upstream level are transparent. A market for responsible 3TG minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas needs to be created. Ideas and risk in this regard are very much needed. Civil society organizations from producing countries have a role to play during the review of the regulation planned for 2023, because the impact on the ground will be an important measurement of the success or of the failure of the EU regulation. Finally, civil society organizations from producing countries have a role in multi-stakeholder initiatives, like the European Partnership for Responsible Minerals. Their role in this partnership can, for example, be to represent voices from artisanal and small-scale mining communities. Also to bring challenges and solutions from the upstream side into the EU policy debate. And finally, to identify needs for support for the artisanal and small-scale mining communities. This was my presentation introducing the European Union Conflict Minerals Regulation. Thank you very much for listening.